Hello and welcome. My name is Imara Jones, host of FSTV Talks at the People's Summit, for a series of in-depth conversations with people who are here at this progressive gathering this year in Chicago. We're joined today by Bill Mckibben, who is the founder of 350.org, the global grassroots climate change movement organization. He's one of the godfathers of the climate change movement, perhaps the James Brown of the climate change movement, as it were, and is a leading reason for how we think about climate change and the way in which we talk about climate change. We're focused here on a series of topics that are critical to our future at this pivotal moment of time. Of course, there's no more important issue than climate change, made even more so by President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. Now, one of the most interesting things about climate change is the fact that although quite clearly it imperils the planet, it disproportionately impacts people of color around the world who are on the front lines, both in the United States and around the world. For all of these reasons, we're happy to unpack and to delve into all of this with the legendary, Soul Summit Climate #1, Bill Mckibben.
It's good to be with you, Imara. It really is.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this and for taking the time. I know you're on a tight schedule. I wanted first to go into your diagnosis and prognosis for exactly where we are in climate change. That is to say, if Mother Earth really did exist and you were a doctor and she walked into your office and said, you know, Bill, you've looked after me for a long time, practically all your life. You know me better than almost anyone else. What is the state of my health and what's the prognosis?
Man, that's a really good way of asking the question. So let's begin with the good news, I guess. In the largest sense, the Earth is going to survive. A million years from now, there'll still be a large rock positioned 3 rocks out from the sun, orbiting our star. Why not? But the question is, will it be anything like the world that we know? And, we seem to be dead set on making sure the answer to that's no. The Earth has been remarkably stable in the 10,000 years or so of human history. And that's because the temperature stayed more or less the same, because the level of CO2 in the atmosphere stayed more or less the same. But of course, 200 years ago, we started burning coal and gas and oil and putting CO2 in the atmosphere in large quantities. And now the Earth, to use your metaphor, is running one hell of a fever. We've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like so much, but if you think about it in a different way, the extra heat that we trap here near the planet every day is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, all right?
Wow.
And so that's been enough heat so far to melt most of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. We think sometime in the next week or two, an iceberg the size of the state of Delaware is going to break off the Larsen ice shelf in the Antarctic.
Wow.
We watched last year as the biggest living structure on the planet, the Great Barrier Reef on the edge of Australia.
Right.
About half of it died in the course of a couple of weeks as this wave of warm water sweeps across the Pacific. The diagnosis is a fever that's getting worse and worse and worse. At the moment, even if all the countries in the world follow the promises they made in Paris, which our country has now declared it won't follow, but even if they did, the temperature would still go up about 3.5 degrees Celsius, 6 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit, enough probably to make sure we can't have civilizations anything like the ones we're used to having. You could talk all night about what that means. There was a study yesterday that said that by 2050, you could expect the 100-year storm, the sort of huge storm you only now would get once in 100 years, will come about every month. The flooding from that in San Diego or Key West or other places along the coasts. We already see incredible damage. Look at California, which had epic drought for 5 years and now is having unprecedented rainfall and in some places floods. That was a huge problem for California, but California's rich.
Right.
It can deal with it. When you have epic drought in Syria, which we had from about 2006 to 2010, well, 80% of the country's livestock died. 1 million people moved off the farm into the cities. It was one of the key things that destabilized that country, kicking it into civil war, and now we see the effects of it spread across the Middle East, into Europe, around the world. So it's the diagnosis is way too much carbon in the atmosphere, and the prognosis, unless we get our act together fast, is dire.
Now, one of the things that you spoke about was degrees, 3.5 degrees. And I think that one of the things that loses people often in the conversation is that when you talk about 3.5 or 2 degrees or 1 degree Celsius, it doesn't sound like a whole lot. But as I told someone, I said, the difference between you being at 98 degrees and 100 is a lot. So can you just talk about the fact that these minor changes in the planet have pretty big consequences in terms of volatility?
Sure. Everything that happens on the face of the Earth, except volcanoes and earthquakes, draws its power from the amount of the sun's energy that we trap here in the narrow envelope of atmosphere in which we live. So when we increase the amount of energy in there, one of the things it does is make the planet warmer, but it also amps up everything else that draws energy on our Earth. The wind blows harder, water evaporates more, and so now we see just unbelievable changes. I mean, the seasons are shifting and shifting dramatically. And when we see, those averages hide the great extremes that come statistically.
Right, because those are average numbers.
Last week, the temperature in cities in parts of Pakistan set a new all-time, we think it's the highest temperatures ever recorded on the planet, 129 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, my oven you can set it lower than 129 degrees. 129 degrees, people can't live, at least not for long. I mean, if you shelter inside and you have a fan, you might be okay for a while, but not very long. Your body needs to cool down at night from that, and it just doesn't happen. So this is the kind of thing that becomes more and more commonplace as the years go on.
Right, and I think you made a really important point that climate change is actually climate volatility. And I think one of the leading scientists, Jim Henson, who I'm sure that you know, said recently that if anything, his estimates were conservative, that he is seeing things faster and more rapidly and more violent than he ever estimated, and he's one of the original
I wrote
climate change scientists.
First book about climate change came out in 1989, so before you were born, back in the olden days. And at the time we knew we were in trouble, we just didn't know how fast. Scientists are conservative in their predictions. The things that they thought would be happening 75 years from now are happening now.
Wow.
And that's very scary.
Wow.
I mean, we only have so many big physical features on the planet. There's the Arctic and the Antarctic. We don't have some other ice caps someplace else. If those two are melting, well, that's not a good sign.
Right. One of the things that you just mentioned as well was referencing Paris. So Paris, by your own admission, wasn't enough to stop this runaway train, right? And so one of the things that I find interesting is the fact that a conservative rationale for withdrawing from Paris, and I don't like to give a lot of airtime because these aren't equivalent arguments,
it's actually good.
These are not equivalent arguments, but in the mainstream media, they're portrayed as equivalent, so I think it's important for us to take the opportunity to address them. One of the arguments that I'm sure President Trump heard from Scott Pruitt, because it was driven by a lot of conservative think tanks and foundations, is that, look, Paris is only going to stop warming by tenths of degrees. It's bounding the United States. It's not mandatory, so we should just withdraw. And if you were in the room with them, what would have been your answer?
Well, I mean, look, this is, of course, it's a silly argument. It's a silly argument in part because Paris, though far from perfect, accomplishes a lot. It cuts about 1 degree Celsius off how much the planet would warm.
So they're also using misleading numbers because they say 2
big
tenths.
Big surprise.
Yeah.
But in the second place, the hope from Paris was that by sending a strong signal to governments and probably more importantly to capital markets and investors about where the future lay, we'd see progress faster than what Paris anticipated, that its targets would become floors, not ceilings. And indeed, some of that seemed to have been happening in the last year or two. China and India in particular are installing renewable capacity at rates far greater than people anticipated. They're way ahead of what their targets were for their Paris pledges. That's one of the reasons that the fossil fuel industry is so freaked out. I mean, the fact that the solar panel gets cheaper every quarter makes it every quarter more difficult to stay in the coal and gas and oil business. But those guys have a lot of money, and they're able to use it, as you pointed out, to dominate our political system for the moment. And so that's what Trump is. It's an attempt to hold back the tide of history for 5, 10, 15 years so they can make some more money. And the problem is that 5, 10, 15 years may be enough to break the planet. You know, that's how close we are on what kind of knife edge we want.
Can you talk a little bit then about why, if it benefits the coal and fossil fuel industry to pull back from Paris, because as Paris proceeds, their competitors get cheaper, and so there's an even greater pull to pull away from them. But from a PR standpoint, at least on Paris, ExxonMobil and Shell and others were publicly saying, we want to stay in Paris, we don't want to withdraw.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Exxon, I think, probably did want to stay in Paris because they've turned themselves into largely a natural gas company. And their thinking is that that the Paris Accords will wipe out coal and hence, at least for the moment, make natural gas more useful. That's bad because what Paris doesn't do is really anything at all about the methane that comes when you burn natural gas.
Right.
But these guys are thinking old school. Their thinking is 2, 3, 4 years old when solar panels cost twice as much as they cost now. We don't need any bridge fuels like natural gas. We can make the leap straight to where we're going, straight to sun and wind now. And we can do it fast if we set our minds to it. We know this is true because we watch a few places do it.
Right.
I mean, the Danes generated 100% of their power some days, and 50% overall.
Same with the UK, right? Wasn't it recently?
This is either because Denmark's figured out how to steal the world's wind supply and from everybody else, or it's because they've taken the technology that we all have and put it to use, and they're going to be way out ahead of everybody. I mean, that's the other reason, by the way, that what Trump is doing is so stupid. He's making sure that America is going to be also ran in the race for who's going to dominate the technologies that come before us. And those technologies are the ones that provide jobs by the score, you know. Oil and gas are capital intensive, but they don't take many people. You can put solar panels on every roof in America. That's a lot of people climbing up ladders and swinging hammers.
Right. One of the things that you said recently in the New York Times op-ed is that that Paris, the withdrawal, was the one of the stupidest things that was done. I think it was stupid and reckless.
Stupid and reckless. I think it's definitely the dumbest thing we've done since the war in Iraq, you know.
Well, that's pretty dumb.
Yeah.
So, in the withdrawal and all of the consequences, what do you think is the stupidest thing and the most reckless? There's a long litany, but what are the things that really strike you?
Well, I mean, I think just in general, the idea that Trump has decided that, I mean, here's the gamble he's making. The scientists got this all wrong, that all the scientists in the world who study climate change missed something that Donald Trump, has figured out.
Right.
So if you really got to be willing to bet on the long shot for that horse to come in.
That's right.
I mean, it does not seem, given what we know about Mr. Trump's, I mean, no matter what you think of his politics, the idea that he's, a savant about science seems a
low down on the
stretch.
list.
Yeah.
One of the impacts of the volatility that's caused by the climate, the fact that we are on track for a runaway train unless we do something, Paris is the down payment, all the things that you're talking about. I mean, one of the interesting things to me as an observer is the fact that climate change doesn't play out equally everywhere. And that particularly one of the interesting things in the United States and around the world is the disproportionate impact that it has on poor people and people of color in terms of resilience, in terms of where people have been zoned.
It's not just that it doesn't play out equally. I mean, truthfully, around the world, there's an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much of the trouble you caused and how quickly you're going to feel the pain.
Wow.
You know, I mean, you go to Bangladesh, which is, you know, going to be underwater and already has huge problems with mosquito-borne disease and typhoons coming in.
Climate refugees there, right?
Climate refugees by the tens and hundreds of thousands. I mean, you can't even, the amount of carbon they produce is a rounding error. The 180 million people there, I mean, nobody has a car, you know. Not their fault. Not the fault of people in the low-lying Pacific Islands that are going to disappear if we're not lucky this century. No, it's if you looked for the perfect example of unfairness, this is it. You know. That said, I mean, it's going to hit everybody, and it already is eventually. I mean, even Donald Trump, his little palace down there in Palm Beach is 2 or 3 feet off the Atlantic Ocean, man. He's not, you know, sitting pretty either. But no question that it's, as I said before, you know, if it happens when things bad happen in California, for the moment we can pay for it. I mean, we have enough money to, but when bad things happen in Bangladesh, who's paying for that?
Right, but even here though, when we have these climate-driven events,
Katrina, Sandy.
Yeah, exactly. They play out differently
Absolutely.
In terms of who is able to
Does that
spring back
surprise
and
you?
no, it doesn't surprise me. So I wonder what the conversation is in the climate movement about climate justice.
The climate movement really is, at this point, more or less led by frontline communities, indigenous communities, which are, you know,
it's 350's mission, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, so we've had now these 2 giant People's Climate March, one in New York and one just a month or so ago in DC, with hundreds of thousands of people. One of my jobs at each one of these is to get there early in the morning so I can talk with the senators and the movie stars and things who arrive and explain why they're not going to be at the front of the parade.
Oh, wow.
Why the first, you know, 40 blocks of people are going to be indigenous communities and frontline communities and places like that. And, you know, I say, don't worry, the cameras will find you. Just be back here a little bit, it'll be good, you know. Yeah. But that's important, and it really recognizes who's been in the lead in these fights.
That's right.
I mean, you know, there were some people who were like surprised when all the action came at Standing Rock around the Dakota pipeline. It didn't surprise me a bit because Native Americans on both sides of the border had been huge leaders in this fight for a decade. You know, that's where a lot of the action came from.
Right.
Standing Rock just made it clear.
Right, of where the pushback in those communities is coming from. And even it's true against the pushback on the location of refineries in the Gulf and a whole host of other things.
Look, we made the Gulf of Mexico is like a national sacrifice zone. You got some crappy thing that's going to pollute everybody and give everybody cancer. Put it in Louisiana and Mississippi. That's, you know, that's basically what we do. Maybe part of Texas too. It's like, that's, you know, we've written it off. I mean, Louisiana is like, literally we're writing it off. It's like disappearing in big chunks every day, you know, as sea level rises. You know, that's not acceptable.
One of the things is the fact that a lot of the problems and the pushback are in the communities that you're talking about, and 350 does a lot of grassroots organizing and helping communities figure out ways to address the climate crisis. But a lot of the solutions are there as well, and one of the interesting things is that you just returned from Tanzania where they're in coastal communities, sort of localized solar projects.
Well, it's actually sort of even bigger than that. I just was over in much of Africa, first in West Africa, in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, and then in Tanzania in East Africa, doing a story for the New Yorker about the very rapid spread of solar power now. I mean, here's the bottom line. There's 600 million people in Africa with no electricity. Okay? I mean, the 200 years of the fossil fuel revolution might as well not have happened.
Right.
You know, Thomas Edison might as well not have lived, you know, for as far as those 600 million people are concerned, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden, the cost of a solar panel has gotten so cheap that people, it's not aid agencies and governments aren't doing the work, it's companies that are now, have figured out that they can, for 30, 40, 50 cents a day, give people light and television. I mean, I was in places communities where they had like the first cold drink that anyone had ever had in their community, because finally there was power and someone had a refrigerator. I mean, one in the community, but still, I mean, they're, refrigerator full of cold drinks. If it's 92 degrees every day the way it is when you live in Ghana near the equator, that's a nice thing, and the fact that it's coming straight from the sun is pretty sweet.
Unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of our time. I could talk to you forever. Everyone could talk to you forever. I would love to talk to you more about Tanzania because, as I said, my mom worked as an aid worker there, and that's where our name comes from. But in our limited time, one of the most important things about where we are and why we are here is the gathering of young activists, actually the future Bill Mckibbens. And one of the things that you have said in the past is that 350.org, this global organization, started with 7 people in a room. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about the importance of people continuing to begin small to make change.
So begin small, because everything begins small by definition, but think big, Yeah, we started 350.org 8 years ago with 7 college students and me, and we had no idea what we were doing. And we think that probably was essential to our, essential not to know what we couldn't do. We think, they've organized about 20,000 protests around the world in every country except North Korea, and we've helped with a lot of fights. And it's all been just with volunteers, just all over the world, everybody pitching in. We can build movements, but we got to be convinced that they matter, The hardest thing about climate change is it seems so big and we seem so small. And truthfully, as individuals, we are too small to have any real impact. My house is covered with solar panels. I drive an electric car. It's all good. I don't try to fool myself that that's making any real difference. The only chance we got at this point is for individuals to stop worrying about being individuals, become somewhat less individuals, join together in the kind of movements that change the way things happen on this planet.
Are you more hopeful than you were in 1989? As hopeful, less hopeful? Have you always been hopeful?
What I've mainly done is sworn off the business of, I don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. One wakes up in the morning and tries to figure out how to cause as much trouble as possible in the course of the next 16 hours, and go to sleep and do it again the next day.
And one last thing, do you believe that the United States, despite stupid and reckless as it might be doing right now, is there any hope in the fact that state and localities and indigenous nations have said we're going to, In
some ways, Donald Trump's a great organizer, right? He's got a bunch of people off their butts and doing things, and since we can't do anything in Washington at the moment because it's run by oafs and idiots, then we better figure out how to do things in city halls and state capitals and you name it, all over the place. And people are. That's good.
And sort of landing the plane here, what is the thing that you're most excited about right now as a climate change activist, and given your life? Like, what's the thing that it's just in your head right now?
I'm so excited right now that there are cities all over the country that are announcing that they're going 100% renewable energy, that they're committed to that. Some of them are the places you'd expect, frankly, the Berkeleys of the world. But now it's Atlanta. Trump, in his speech, said, well, I was elected to represent Pittsburgh, not Paris, or whatever it was he said. The next day, the mayor of Pittsburgh said, A, we didn't vote for you, and B, we're going 100% renewable energy because we know climate change is an enormous threat. That makes me happy.
Well, that's it, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
Imara,
it was wonderful to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for taking us through. This is going to be really impactful and beneficial to our audience. And you're on a plane somewhere soon.
On we go.
On we go.